What if I told you that the loudest sound at one of Hollywood's most polished, carefully choreographed award shows wasn't applause, but boos? Not whispers, not awkward silence, but audible, undeniable heckling, cutting through the glitter, the gowns, the rehearsed smiles. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what if I told you it wasn't an accident? Because on that night, at the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards, something snapped. Not just in the room, but in the relationship between Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the public that once cheered them. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever watched a moment unfold and felt, deep down, that you were witnessing the end of an era, even if no one dared to say it out loud? Because that's exactly what many people felt when the cameras panned to Harry and Meghan, seated under blinding lights, dressed impeccably, smiling. While the sound around them told a very different story. This wasn't supposed to happen. Award shows are safe spaces for celebrities, controlled environments, carefully curated rooms where even controversy is softened by politeness, where applause is almost automatic, where awkward moments are edited out before most viewers ever notice them. And yet, on this night, something slipped through the cracks. A sound, a reaction, a rupture. At first, many viewers weren't even sure they heard it correctly. Was that a boo? Was it just one person? Was it misinterpreted applause? But then it happened again, and suddenly, the question wasn't whether it was real, but why it was happening at all. Because this wasn't a tabloid crowd. This wasn't a protest. This was Hollywood's own actors, producers, insiders, industry elites. The very people who had once opened doors, offered platforms, and applauded these two as symbols of change. So what changed? That's the question everyone thinks they know the answer to. But here's the truth. The booing didn't begin in that room. It didn't begin that night. And it certainly didn't begin with a single heckler losing their composure. It began years earlier, quietly, with moments that were easy to dismiss at the time. Interviews that felt emotionally powerful until they didn't. Projects that promised revelation until they repeated themselves. Narratives that once felt brave until they began to feel familiar. And familiarity, as you know, is dangerous in a culture addicted to novelty. Let's rewind for a moment. There was a time when Harry and Meghan could do no wrong, at least in the eyes of much of the public. Their story was framed as a modern fairy tale with an edge. Love versus tradition. Authenticity versus protocol. Two people stepping away from an ancient institution to reclaim their voices. It was dramatic. It was emotional. It was compelling. People listened. People sympathized. People applauded. But applause, like sympathy, has a shelf life. And somewhere along the way, something subtle shifted. The same stories began to sound different. The same grievances began to feel heavier. The same spotlight that once illuminated injustice began to expose contradictions. Now, here's where things get uncomfortable. Because this story isn't just about Harry and Meghan. It's about us. It's about how audiences change. How empathy can slowly turn into exhaustion. How admiration can quietly morph into skepticism, not with a bang, but with a sigh. Have you ever supported someone fiercely, only to wake up one day and realize you were no longer sure why? That's the emotional space many viewers were already in long before the Critics' Choice Awards rolled around. And Hollywood? Hollywood felt it too. Despite what we're often told, the industry is not immune to public mood. In fact, it's hyper-aware of it. Executives read social media sentiment like stock charts. Producers watch engagement numbers obsessively. Agents know when a name excites people and when it makes them roll their eyes. By early 2026, the whispers had already started. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, just quiet recalculations, polite distance, fewer enthusiastic endorsements. And then came the announcement. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle would be attending the Critics' Choice Awards. On paper, it made sense. High profile, global recognition, a room full of influential people. But behind the scenes, the reaction wasn't unanimous excitement. Some insiders were confused. Others were wary. A few were openly annoyed. Why? Because award shows, especially ones like the Critics' Choice Awards, are not just celebrations. They're signals. They communicate who is embraced, who is relevant, and who belongs in the cultural moment. And by 2026, that question, Do Harry and Meghan still belong at the center of Hollywood's cultural conversation? Was no longer rhetorical. It was contested. Still, no one expected what would happen next. Because Hollywood has rules. Unspoken ones. You clap. You smile. You keep your opinions private. Public rejection is rare. Public humiliation even rarer. Which is why the first sound caught everyone off guard. Imagine being in that room. The lights dim. The energy shifts. Your name, or presence, is acknowledged. You expect applause. Maybe thunderous. Maybe polite. But instead, you hear something else. A disruption. A sharp note of disapproval cutting through the atmosphere. Your brain scrambles to process it. Did I hear that right? Was that meant for us? And as the moment stretches, just a second too long, the realization settles in. This is real. This is happening. And suddenly, the cameras don't know where to look. Producers hesitate. Directors cut away. The room stiffens. Because everyone understands the same thing at once. This isn't just awkward. It's symbolic. And symbols are dangerous. Especially when they reveal something people have been trying not to say out loud. Now, before anyone rushes to conclusions, let's be clear about one thing. This wasn't a mob. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't a total collapse of decorum. It was controlled, measured, almost restrained, which makes it even more unsettling, because it suggested intent, and intent implies meaning. So what did the boos mean? Were they about resentment, fatigue, a sense of betrayal? Or were they simply the sound of an audience finally responding honestly, without the filter of politeness? That's the tension we're going to unpack, layer by layer. Because the truth is far more complex than a single moment of embarrassment. This was about build-up, pressure, unspoken frustration, and a series of decisions, some public, some private, that led to one unavoidable outcome. But here's the part no one talks about. What most people watching at home didn't see was that the room had already been primed. The mood wasn't neutral going in. The atmosphere wasn't forgiving. And certain choices made earlier that evening, choices that seemed insignificant at the time, ensured that if something went wrong, it would go very wrong. Seating arrangements, timing, context, small things. But small things matter when tension is already in the air. And once that first sound escaped the room, there was no putting it back. Because applause can be encouraged. But boos? Boos reveal what people were already thinking. So let me ask you this. Was this moment cruel or inevitable? Was it a failure of empathy or the consequence of overexposure? And most importantly, was this the end of something or the beginning of a much bigger reckoning? Because as uncomfortable as that night was, what followed was even more revealing. Backstage reactions, strategic silence, media spin, and a narrative war that began before the echoes of the boos had even faded. And once you understand what happened next, and what had been quietly building long before, that moment at the Critics' Choice Awards will look far less shocking, and far more unavoidable. But to understand that, we have to go back. Back before the cameras. Back before the seating chart. Back before the invitation that, in hindsight, should never have been sent. Because the night Hollywood froze didn't begin with boos. It began with a decision. And that decision changed everything. The room was beautiful, almost aggressively so. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of carefully placed tables. The lighting was warm, flattering, forgiving, designed to make everyone look like the best version of themselves. The Critics' Choice Awards had perfected this atmosphere over the years. Glamorous, but not stiff. Prestigious, but relaxed enough to feel authentic. This was supposed to be a celebration. But something felt off. Have you ever walked into a room and sensed tension before anyone spoke? That faint pressure in the air, like the calm before a storm you can't quite see yet? That was the feeling. No alarms. No shouting. Just a subtle unease. The kind people ignore because it's inconvenient to acknowledge. Backstage, producers were checking cue cards. Presenters rehearsed jokes. Cameras glided smoothly across the crowd, capturing laughter that was just a little too polished. And then there they were. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Seated prominently. Visible. Impossible to miss. They looked composed. Stylish. Calm, at least on the surface. Harry leaned slightly forward, hands loosely clasped. Meghan sat upright, poised, smiling at familiar faces across the room. From the outside, it looked like any other awards show moment. But watch closely, and you'll notice something strange. People weren't leaning in toward them. They weren't eager. There were smiles, yes, but they were quick, polite, the kind that end conversations instead of starting them. You might not catch it if you weren't looking for it, but the camera did, and the camera never lies. It only reveals things faster than we're comfortable admitting. Now let's slow this down, because moments like this don't explode out of nowhere. They build quietly, invisibly, until one tiny spark brings everything into focus. The program moved forward as planned. Awards were announced. Winners thanked critics, collaborators, and agents. Laughter rippled through the room at well-timed jokes. Normal, safe, predictable. And then came the moment. Not the big moment, not yet. The small one that preceded it. The cue. A presenter referenced a category tied loosely to social impact, cultural relevance, and public influence. It wasn't explicitly about Harry and Meghan, but it hovered close enough that attention shifted toward their table. The camera cut to them. That's when it happened. At first, it was faint. So faint that even seasoned sound engineers might have second-guessed themselves. A low sound. Not applause. Not laughter. Something sharper. A boo? No. That couldn't be right. Award show audiences don't boo. Not like that. Not in that room. Producers hesitated for half a second, a lifetime in live television. The camera lingered just long enough for confusion to ripple across faces nearby. Some people froze. Others glanced around, trying to confirm what they'd just heard. And then, unmistakably, it happened again. Louder this time. Clearer. The sound cut through the air like a record scratch. Boo. Not screamed. Not chaotic. Measured. Intentional. Have you ever heard a sound that instantly changes the temperature of a room? Where every muscle tightens at once. That was it. Harry's smile faltered, just slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Meghan's expression didn't change at first, but her eyes shifted. Quick. Calculating. Scanning. They knew. Everyone knew. The room stiffened. People who had been mid-sip froze with glasses inches from their lips. Conversations died in half-sentences. Laughter evaporated. And here's the part that matters most. No one clapped to drown it out. Not immediately. That hesitation, that brief pause, spoke volumes. Because in that pause, the room was deciding something. Do we cover this up? Or do we let it happen? 1 second passed. Then 2. And instead of applause, there was nothing. Silence is loud when you expect noise. The boos didn't grow into a roar. They didn't need to. They had already landed. The damage was done. Producers reacted fast after that. Cameras cut away to a wide shot. Then to the stage. Then to a reaction shot of a different table entirely. Someone laughing, someone clapping, someone safe. But the audience at home had already caught it. Social media exploded in real time. Did you hear that? Was that directed at them? No way. Rewind that. Clips circulated within minutes. Zoomed-in footage. Enhanced audio. Frame-by-frame breakdowns. Because once people sense a crack in the facade, they can't look away. Inside the room, the energy never fully recovered. You could feel it in the applause that followed, slightly delayed, slightly forced. In the way presenters rushed their lines. In how winners thanked the room a little faster than usual. And at that table, Harry and Meghan remained still. Composed, but not relaxed. You might wonder why they didn't leave. Why they didn't make an excuse, stand up, disappear quietly into the background. But leaving would have said something too. Staying was a statement, whether intentional or not, because walking out would have confirmed the moment as catastrophic. Staying tried to neutralize it, but neutralizing something like that is harder than it looks. Because now, everything they did was being watched. Every smile, every glance, every whisper between them. And here's something most people didn't notice until later. Nearby tables shifted away, subtly, chairs angled just slightly outward. Bodies turned toward the stage instead of toward them. No one wanted to be caught reacting the wrong way. In Hollywood, proximity is perception, and perception is currency. This was no longer just about a boo. It was about association. Who sits with whom? Who laughs together? Who avoids eye contact? These micro-movements are invisible to casual viewers, but they're everything in a room like this. And Harry and Meghan felt it. You could see it in the way Meghan adjusted her posture. Straighter, firmer. In the way Harry nodded politely at someone who didn't quite meet his eyes. This wasn't hostility. It was something colder. Distance. Now let's pause here and ask the uncomfortable question. Why didn't anyone intervene? Why didn't producers immediately flood the room with applause? Why didn't presenters redirect attention more aggressively? The answer is unsettling. Because sometimes silence isn't confusion. Sometimes it's agreement. Not agreement with the act, but with the sentiment behind it. That's what made this moment different from a heckle at a comedy show or a rogue outburst at a sporting event. This wasn't chaos. This was restraint failing. And when restraint fails in a room trained to maintain it, something deeper is happening. The rest of the ceremony continued, technically speaking. Awards were handed out. Speeches were made. Smiles returned, sort of. But the emotional center of the night had shifted. Everyone knew it. Even those pretending not to. By the time the ceremony wrapped, the conversations had already begun. Quiet ones. Urgent ones. Whispered near exits and bathroom mirrors. Did you hear it too? I can't believe that happened. This is going to be everywhere. And it was. But what's fascinating is how quickly the narrative fractured. Some outlets downplayed it. Others denied it entirely. A few framed it as misunderstanding. But denial doesn't work in the age of replay. Because viewers at home weren't asking whether it happened. They were asking why. And that's where things get really interesting. Because once you understand what led up to that night, the invitations, the whispers, the subtle shifts in Hollywood's mood, that boo stops looking like a shocking anomaly and starts looking like the inevitable release of pressure. The night Hollywood froze wasn't just about one sound. It was about years of unspoken tension finally finding a voice. And as uncomfortable as that moment was in the room, what happened next, backstage, in the press, and behind closed doors, would prove that the real fallout was only just beginning. Because the boos didn't end when the cameras cut away. They echoed. And those echoes would follow Harry and Meghan far beyond that ballroom. But to understand why the room was so primed to react the way it did, we need to rewind even further to a decision made long before anyone took their seat. An invitation that raised eyebrows, a choice that split opinions, and a question no one wanted to answer out loud. Why were they there at all? Because the invitation itself may have set everything in motion. And once you see how that happened, the night Hollywood froze starts to make terrifying sense. But that decision, the one that quietly loaded the gun, comes next, and it changes everything. The controversy didn't start with a sound. It started with an email. Quiet, unassuming, easily overlooked. An invitation. Because before the cameras rolled, before the lights warmed the room, before anyone adjusted a microphone or rehearsed a joke, someone made a decision that would ripple outward in ways they never anticipated. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were invited to the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards. On the surface, that might sound perfectly normal, even expected. After all, they were still globally recognizable figures, still headline magnets, still capable of pulling attention simply by entering a room. But in Hollywood, invitations are never just about recognition. They're about timing. They're about momentum. They're about reading the room before you step into it. And this time, the room had already started to change. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been invited somewhere and later realized maybe you shouldn't have gone? Not because you did anything wrong in that moment, but because the energy had already shifted and no one bothered to warn you. That's the uncomfortable question hanging over this chapter. Because by early 2026, Harry and Meghan's relationship with Hollywood was no longer simple. It wasn't openly hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was cautious, transactional, and increasingly distant. To understand why this invitation raised eyebrows, you need to understand how award shows actually work behind the scenes. Despite what viewers see, these events are not purely about celebrating art or achievement. They're strategic ecosystems. Every seat, every appearance, every invitation is weighed against optics. Who does this benefit? Who does this upset? Who brings goodwill? And who brings baggage? And by the time the Critics' Choice Awards team finalized their guest list, Harry and Meghan carried something new with them. Not outrage, not scandal, fatigue. Hollywood is many things, but patient isn't one of them. There had been a time when their presence guaranteed buzz, the good kind. Coverage that felt earnest. Conversations about change, courage, and breaking away from tradition. But somewhere along the way, that buzz shifted. Stories began to repeat themselves. Revelations started sounding familiar. Emotional weight turned into emotional expectation. And expectation is dangerous because it sets a standard that must constantly be exceeded. Now add one more layer. Awards season in 2026 was already tense. Studios were fighting for relevance. Streamers were desperate to prove cultural legitimacy. Audiences were vocal about feeling disconnected from elite spaces. The Critics' Choice Awards, in particular, were under pressure to appear authentic, less manufactured, more reflective of real public sentiment. That made every decision risky, including this one. According to industry insiders, the debate around inviting Harry and Meghan wasn't explosive. It was quiet, subdued. The kind of discussion that happens in side conversations and email threads, where no one wants to be the villain, but everyone wants to avoid a problem. Some argued their inclusion was obvious. They're still important, one insider reportedly said. They still draw attention. Others weren't so sure. Attention isn't the same as goodwill, another voice countered. And that distinction mattered more than ever. Because attention can turn on you in seconds. Goodwill takes years to build and moments to lose. What complicated things further was the lack of a clear reason for their presence. They weren't nominees. They weren't presenters. They weren't directly tied to a major film or television project being honored that night. Their attendance was symbolic. And symbolism cuts both ways. For supporters, it signaled continued relevance. For critics, it felt like overexposure. And for a growing number of people in the industry, it felt forced. Still, the invitation went out. Why? Because no one wanted to be the one who said no. That's the dirty secret of Hollywood. Exclusion is risky. It creates headlines. It invites accusations. It suggests judgment. Inclusion feels safer until it isn't. So the Critics' Choice Awards did what many institutions do when faced with uncertainty. They hedged. They invited them. But here's the part that matters. They didn't roll out the red carpet the way they once might have. There was no central positioning in the promotional material. No special announcement. No narrative framing explaining why Harry and Meghan would be there. They were invited, but quietly. And in Hollywood, quiet inclusion often signals ambivalence. Behind the scenes, some insiders were already uneasy because they knew something the public didn't yet fully grasp. The room they were walking into was not uniformly supportive. It was split. Some attendees admired them. Others were tired of them. And a few were openly resentful, not out of malice, but out of frustration. Frustration with being lectured. Frustration with narratives that felt one-sided. Frustration with what they perceived as moral positioning without accountability. Now, imagine putting all of those people in one room. Add alcohol. Add cameras. Add the pressure of live television. And then seat Harry and Meghan somewhere highly visible. This wasn't negligence. It was miscalculation. Because the awards team assumed something that had always been true before. That even if people felt privately conflicted, they would behave publicly. They assumed decorum would win. But decorum only works when people believe in the rules. And by 2026, some people no longer did. There's another detail that's crucial here. Timing. The invitation went out just weeks after a fresh wave of online criticism reignited debates around Harry and Meghan's public narrative. Old clips resurfaced. Past statements were re-examined. Contradictions, real or perceived, were circulating again. The mood online was not forgiving. And Hollywood, despite its curated image, reads the internet closely. So when attendees saw Harry and Meghan's names on the guest list, reactions varied. Some shrugged, some sighed, and some quietly braced themselves. Because they knew that if something went wrong, even something small, it would be amplified instantly. There would be no benefit of the doubt. No grace period. Just reaction. Still, no one expected an outright rupture. Because again, this was Hollywood. People are trained here. Trained to clap. Trained to smile. Trained to suppress discomfort in favor of professionalism. That training usually works. Until it doesn't. What the invitation failed to account for was something far more powerful than etiquette. Emotional saturation. When audiences and insiders feel they've heard the same emotional story too many times, something changes. Empathy dulls. Curiosity fades. And what replaces it isn't hatred. It's impatience. And impatience is far more volatile. Because it doesn't want to engage. It wants distance. So when Harry and Meghan accepted the invitation, they were stepping into a room that was already emotionally charged, without fully realizing it. From their perspective, This was just another high-profile appearance. Another opportunity to maintain visibility. Another night in the public eye. But the context had shifted. And context, more than intention, determines outcome. As the date approached, small warning signs appeared. Media coverage of their attendance was muted. No buzz pieces celebrating their presence. No enthusiastic previews speculating about their role. Instead, there was silence. A vacuum. And vacuums get filled. Speculation crept in. Why are they going? What are they promoting? What's the angle? None of those questions had satisfying answers. And when people don't understand why someone is showing up, they start questioning whether they should be there at all. By the time Harry and Meghan arrived that night, the invitation had already done its damage. It had created expectation without clarity, visibility without purpose, and presence without consensus. That's a dangerous combination in a room full of powerful, opinionated people who rarely speak their minds publicly. The awards team would later insist they couldn't have predicted what happened. But that's not entirely true. They may not have predicted booze, but they ignored warning signs. They mistook silence for neutrality. They assumed politeness would override emotion. And they forgot one crucial thing. When you invite someone into a divided room, you're not just offering them a seat. You're offering them the temperature of the space. And that temperature was already rising. So when Harry and Meghan took their seats, smiling, composed, unaware of how many silent calculations had already been made around them, the stage was set, not for celebration, but for exposure. And the irony? The invitation that was meant to normalize their presence ended up highlighting just how contested it had become. Because the moment the sound broke through the room, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't about bad manners. It was about a misread moment. And once the invitation collided with a room that no longer felt obligated to applaud, there was no going back. But the invitation was only the first domino. Because even with a divided room, nothing would have happened, nothing at all, if the emotional ground hadn't already shifted long before that night. And to understand that shift, we have to zoom out, away from the ballroom, away from the award season, and into the slow, subtle change in how Hollywood and the public began to see Harry and Meghan. Because sympathy doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes. And that erosion is the real story. The story that made that invitation feel wrong in the first place. And once you see how that goodwill faded, step by step, the reaction in that room stops being shocking and starts feeling almost inevitable. That shift in mood didn't announce itself. It whispered. And those whispers are where we're going next. Because Hollywood didn't turn on them in a moment. It drifted away, and when it did, it took the applause with it. At some point, empathy expires. Not all at once. Not loudly. It doesn't shatter or collapse in a dramatic moment. It thins. Quietly. Almost politely. Until one day you realize it's gone. And no one can quite explain when it happened. That's the hardest part. Because if you asked most people in Hollywood when they stopped feeling emotionally invested in Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's story, they wouldn't point to a headline or a scandal or a single interview. They'd pause. They'd think. And then they'd say something vague. Over time. Gradually. It just changed. That vagueness isn't avoidance. It's honesty. Because this wasn't a fall from grace. It was a slow fade from fascination. Let me ask you something. Have you ever rooted for someone intensely, defended them in conversations, felt genuinely moved by their struggle, and then one day realized you were no longer paying attention? Not angry, not hostile, just disengaged. That emotional disengagement is far more dangerous than outrage. Outrage still means people care. Disengagement means they don't. And by the time the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards rolled around, disengagement had quietly settled in across large parts of Hollywood. It didn't look like backlash. It looked like boredom. It looked like skepticism. It looked like people leaning back in their chairs instead of forward. To understand how that happened, we need to rewind again, not to one moment, but to a pattern. In the early days, Harry and Meghan's narrative felt urgent. There was pain. There was conflict. There was a clear antagonist. Institutions versus individuals. Tradition versus autonomy. Silence versus truth. That framework is powerful. Hollywood loves it. Audiences understand it instinctively. It's the backbone of countless films and series. And for a while, the story delivered. Each appearance felt like a revelation. Each interview promised new insight. Each project carried the weight of importance. But here's the problem with building a public identity around emotional disclosure. You have to keep disclosing. And every time you do, the bar rises. Audiences expect more honesty, more vulnerability, more revelation. Eventually, you run out of new emotional territory. And when that happens, repetition sets in. Hollywood noticed this first, not because it was offended, but because it's trained to detect diminishing returns. Producers began to notice familiar beats. The same grievances framed in slightly different language. The same emotional arcs. The same positioning of victimhood without resolution. And slowly, subtly, the reaction shifted. Not to anger, to questioning. Is this evolving or looping? Is this healing or performing? Those are uncomfortable questions, especially when they're whispered instead of shouted. Because whispers mean people are thinking, not reacting. And thinking audiences are unpredictable. Now layer in another factor. Accountability. As Harry and Meghan positioned themselves as voices of truth, scrutiny followed. Statements were compared. Timelines were cross-checked. Past interviews were replayed alongside newer ones. And in some cases, discrepancies emerged. Not always dramatic, not always damning, but enough to introduce doubt. And doubt is contagious. One contradiction doesn't destroy credibility, but several create friction. And friction creates heat. Online, this manifested as threads, reaction videos, long-form critiques. In Hollywood, it manifested as hesitation. Executives asked tougher questions. Collaborators became cautious. Public praise softened. The tone shifted from celebration to neutrality. And neutrality, in a culture built on enthusiasm, is a warning sign. Another shift happened too, one that Harry and Meghan likely didn't anticipate. Their story began to feel resolved. Not resolved happily, but resolved narratively. They had left. They had spoken. They had explained their pain. The audience had listened. So what now? Hollywood thrives on forward momentum, transformation, reinvention. But the public narrative surrounding Harry and Meghan struggled to move past grievance. That doesn't mean the pain wasn't real. It means the story stopped progressing. And stalled stories lose audiences. This is where irony creeps in. In trying to maintain control over their narrative, Harry and Meghan ended up narrowing it. Every appearance reinforced the same identity. Every project circled the same themes. And what once felt brave began to feel static. Let's be honest for a moment. Audiences don't mind conflict. They mind stagnation. They want evolution. They want surprise. They want growth. By 2026, many people felt they knew exactly what Harry and Meghan would say before they said it. And when predictability replaces curiosity, attention fades. Hollywood felt this acutely, because attention is its lifeblood. And when names stop generating excitement, rooms change. Seats get reassigned. Invitations become conditional. Appearances feel obligatory rather than celebratory. No one announces this shift. It just happens. Another layer complicated things further. Moral authority. Harry and Meghan often spoke from a position of moral clarity, framing their experiences as lessons, warnings, or calls for change. Again, this resonated at first. But moral authority is fragile. It requires consistency, humility, and a willingness to accept critique. When audiences perceive moral authority as performative or selective, resistance forms. Not aggressive resistance. Quiet pushback. Eye rolls. Sighs. Silence. Hollywood, especially, bristles at being lectured. It will applaud activism. It will platform advocacy. But it resists being told who it is by outsiders, especially when those outsiders still benefit from the very system they criticize. This perceived contradiction became a sticking point. How do you critique fame while leveraging it? How do you condemn institutions while seeking validation from them? These questions didn't come with easy answers. And without answers, frustration grew. Now, let's talk about the emotional economy. Sympathy is a finite resource. When someone is in crisis, people rally. But when crisis becomes identity, fatigue sets in. By 2026, many in Hollywood felt they were being asked to feel the same emotions again and again, without a sense of resolution. That doesn't make them cruel. It makes them human. And humans disengage when emotional demands feel endless. This disengagement didn't express itself as hostility. It expressed itself as distance. Less applause, less vocal support, less eagerness to associate. And that distance was already present when Harry and Meghan arrived at the Critics' Choice Awards. The room wasn't hostile. It was detached. And detachment is unstable. Because when detachment meets provocation, even unintentional provocation, it can snap. The awards night didn't create skepticism. It revealed it. The booing didn't introduce a new sentiment. It vocalized one that had been simmering quietly. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many people in that room didn't agree with the heckling, but they understood it. They recognized the emotion behind it. And recognition is not the same as endorsement, but it is complicity. Because when no one rushes to shut something down, it means the ground was already prepared. By the time the sound echoed through that ballroom, the mood shift was complete. Sympathy had thinned. Skepticism had taken its place. Not rage, not cruelty, just a collective questioning. And questioning changes behavior. It changes applause into hesitation. It turns smiles into masks. It turns silence into a statement. So when people ask, how could Hollywood let this happen? The answer is simple. Hollywood didn't let something new happen. It failed to stop something old from surfacing, because the emotional contract had already been renegotiated, and Harry and Meghan were still operating under the old terms. That mismatch between expectation and reality is what made the moment so jarring, so visible, so painful. And yet, this chapter still doesn't explain everything, because skepticism alone doesn't cause public reaction. It creates tension, but tension needs a trigger. Something specific, something immediate, something that turns quiet discomfort into audible response. And that trigger didn't come from the stage. It didn't come from a speech. It came from a rumor, a whisper that spread just days before the awards, a story that never made headlines, but reached the right ears. And once that rumor entered the room, the mood shift turned volatile, because skepticism plus resentment is a dangerous combination. And that combination was already in place when the lights dimmed. The room didn't just feel different that night. It was different. And the reason why becomes impossible to ignore once you hear what people were whispering before anyone took their seats. Because that rumor, whether true or not, primed the room. And once it did, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was only waiting for the right moment. And that moment came fast. Hollywood whispers before it shouts. That's not a metaphor. It's a rule. By the time something becomes public in this town, it's already been discussed, debated, exaggerated, softened, denied, and quietly accepted behind closed doors. The real story rarely breaks with headlines. It seeps in through side conversations, text messages, and half-joking remarks over drinks. And in the days leading up to the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards, one particular whisper was everywhere. Not loud enough to trend, not concrete enough to publish, but persistent enough to matter. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a situation where everyone else seemed to know something you didn't, and you could feel it, even if no one said a word? That's what that room felt like. Because by the time Harry and Meghan arrived, many of the people seated around them weren't reacting to them as individuals in that moment. They were reacting to a story they believed they already knew. And that story, true or not, changed everything. The rumor wasn't singular. It came in variations, different phrasing, different levels of detail. But the core idea was the same, that Harry and Meghan had made specific demands around their appearance. Not outrageous demands, not diva-level tantrums, subtle ones, requests, expectations, the kind that seem reasonable in isolation, but abrasive in context. According to multiple insiders, the whispers suggested that Harry and Meghan's team had pushed for special considerations. Seating visibility, camera positioning, a certain level of acknowledgement from the stage. Nothing officially confirmed. Nothing written down in a way that could be quoted, but enough to create a narrative. And narratives are powerful, especially when they align with existing skepticism. Now, here's where things get tricky. In Hollywood, everyone makes requests. Stars ask for seating adjustments. Studios negotiate camera time. Publicists push for favorable framing. This isn't unusual. What made this rumor combustible wasn't the content. It was the timing. Because remember where the mood already was. Sympathy had thinned. Skepticism had taken root. Fatigue was in the air. So when whispers began circulating that Harry and Meghan were still attempting to control the narrative, still managing optics, still asserting importance in a room that no longer unanimously agreed with that importance, it struck a nerve. Even people who didn't fully believe the rumor felt its weight, because it confirmed something they were already feeling. That disconnect. That sense that Harry and Meghan hadn't recalibrated to the new reality. Let's slow this down. The rumor didn't say, "They're terrible people." It said something far more subtle and far more damaging. It said, "They don't realize the room has changed." And in Hollywood, self-awareness is survival. Those whispers traveled fast. Agents mentioned them to clients. Producers joked about them in passing. Assistants heard them in hallways and repeated them without context. By the time the awards night arrived, the rumor had evolved. Some versions exaggerated it. Some softened it. But the emotional takeaway was consistent. A sense of entitlement. Now, whether that entitlement actually existed is almost beside the point. Because perception drives reaction. And once people believe a narrative fits a pattern, they stop interrogating it. They accept it as probably true. That's how rooms get primed. It's also how goodwill evaporates. What made this rumor especially volatile was that it echoed earlier criticisms that Harry and Meghan had always pushed back against. The idea that they wanted control without responsibility, visibility without vulnerability, sympathy without expiration. Again, not accusations, not facts, but impressions. And impressions matter more than facts in social spaces. By the afternoon of the ceremony, the atmosphere backstage was already tense. Not chaotic, controlled, but alert. Some staff members were uneasy. They'd heard the whispers. They knew where Harry and Meghan were seated. They understood how visible that placement was. And they worried, not about scandal, but about discomfort. Because discomfort spreads. And once it starts, it's hard to contain. Attendees arrived with these whispers already in their heads. They took their seats knowing the rumor existed, even if they didn't believe it fully. And that knowledge changed how they interpreted everything that followed. A delayed clap became intentional. A neutral expression became judgment. A camera cut became confirmation. This is how priming works. The room didn't wait to see what would happen. It was already braced. Now, imagine being Harry and Meghan in that moment, walking into a space where people are smiling. But their smiles don't reach their eyes. Where conversations are polite, but short. Where no one is rude, but no one is warm. That kind of atmosphere is disorienting. Because it gives you no clear signal. No confrontation. No obvious hostility. Just a vague sense that something's wrong. And when you can't identify the problem, you can't address it. That's what makes whispers so powerful. They isolate without accusation. They undermine without exposure. And they create plausible deniability for everyone involved. If confronted, no one admits to believing them. But they still behave as if they do. By the time the ceremony began, the rumor had already done its job. It had framed Harry and Meghan not as guests, but as variables. Unpredictable elements in a carefully managed event. And when events are carefully managed, unpredictability is the enemy. This is where crowd psychology enters the picture. When a group shares an unspoken belief, even a vague one, it shapes collective behavior. People mirror each other. They watch reactions before choosing their own. They look for cues. So when the first moment of discomfort occurred, that subtle shift when attention landed on Harry and Meghan, the room was already waiting. Waiting to see if someone else would react. Waiting for permission. Because the rumor had quietly justified reaction. It gave people a reason, however flimsy, to feel irritated, skeptical, or resistant. And once one person acted on that feeling, the dam cracked. Now, let's be clear. This does not mean the booing was orchestrated. It wasn't planned. It wasn't coordinated. It didn't need to be. Priming removes the need for planning. It creates readiness. And readiness is all a moment needs. Think about it. If that same sound had occurred in a room full of unconditional supporters, it would have been drowned out instantly. Clapped over. Ignored. Dismissed. But in this room, the pause was longer. The reaction slower. Because people were checking in with each other, silently, asking the same question. Are we doing this? And when no one rushed to shut it down, the answer became clear. Yes. Or at least, we're not stopping it. That distinction matters. Because it shifts responsibility from the individual to the collective. No one person became the villain. The room did. And the room had been primed to allow it. After the ceremony, some attendees would insist they hadn't heard any rumors beforehand. Others would admit they had, but dismiss them. But their behavior betrayed something else. They weren't shocked. They were startled, yes, but not surprised. That's the tell. True surprises create chaos. This moment created discomfort, which means, on some level, people were prepared for something to go wrong. And once again, we return to the central irony. The rumor may not have been true, but it didn't need to be, because it aligned with an emotional narrative that had already taken hold. Harry and Meghan as people who hadn't adapted, people who still expected the room to bend toward them, people who didn't realize the applause was conditional. Fair or not, that perception existed, and it shaped the room's response. This is how reputations shift, not through declarations, through accumulation, through whispers that confirm doubts people didn't know how to articulate yet. And once those whispers take root, moments like the one at the Critics' Choice Awards stop being anomalies. They become expressions of something deeper, something unresolved. But here's the part that makes this even more complicated. Not everyone in that room agreed with the reaction. Some were horrified. Some felt it crossed a line. Some worried about the optics. But even those people felt the tension. They felt the change. And they understood why the moment had happened. Even if they wished it hadn't. That understanding is what sealed it. Because when people understand a reaction, they stop defending against it. They rationalize it. And rationalization normalizes behavior. So the rumor didn't cause the booing. It legitimized it. It gave people an internal justification, a narrative hook. And once that hook was in place, all it took was one spark. Which brings us to the moment Harry and Meghan actually walked into the room. Because by then, the whisper had grown into expectation. And expectation shapes perception. The room wasn't neutral anymore. It was loaded. And when you place someone at the center of a loaded room, with cameras rolling and emotions already strained, you don't need a scandal to create fallout. You just need attention. And attention, that night, turned volatile. Because as Harry and Meghan took their seats, they weren't just being watched. They were being evaluated, judged, measured against a narrative they didn't fully know existed. And that's what makes what happened next so painful. Because the walk-in itself, the entrance, the reception, the silence, revealed just how deeply the room had already been primed. And once you see that moment clearly, the rest becomes impossible to unsee. Because the real fracture didn't happen when the boos sounded. It happened when the applause didn't. And that moment, the absence of something once guaranteed, is where everything truly shifted. That's where we're going next. Because the walk-in told a story all its own. A story written not in sound, but in silence. The doors opened. Not dramatically. Not with fanfare. Just a quiet sweep of black fabric and polished shoes across the carpet. Yet in that room, where every movement is magnified, every gesture scrutinized, the walk-in itself became an event. Imagine it. The air is already heavy with expectation. Cameras are rolling. Social media monitors are tracking hashtags in real time. Industry insiders are seated at their tables, drinks in hand, waiting for the ceremony to proceed. And then they see them. Prince Harry, tall, composed, eyes scanning the room. Meghan Markle, poised, radiant, carrying the elegance that had once commanded universal admiration. Their smiles are measured, gestures graceful. But there's something different this time. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, yet charged with tension. Because the moment wasn't greeted with applause. Not immediately. Not the polite, reflexive clapping that usually greets high-profile arrivals. Not the camera flashes that punctuate joy or recognition. There was hesitation. And hesitation in a room trained to perform politeness is a statement. You could feel it in micro-reactions. Chairs shifted slightly. Guests leaned subtly away. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Smiles appeared and disappeared faster than the eye could catch. People checked their neighbors' faces before deciding how to respond. It wasn't hostility. Not outright. It was colder, harder to define. It was calculation, observation, judgment. Have you ever walked into a room and felt invisible even when everyone's eyes are on you? That's what a carefully curated coldness feels like. You are noticed, but not embraced. And Harry and Meghan could feel it. Harry's eyes flicked quickly across tables, noting who looked directly at them and who did not. Meghan's posture tightened subtly, shoulders squared, a defensive grace. Smiles remained, yes, but those smiles were shields. Polished, unyielding shields designed to signal composure while masking unease. For casual viewers at home, this may seem like standard celebrity behavior. They're trained to handle attention, after all. But for people in the room, those subtle shifts were signs of tension, signs that the narrative had changed. Because Hollywood doesn't just respond to people. It responds to stories. And the story of Harry and Meghan had evolved. Sympathy had thinned. Curiosity had been replaced by skepticism. And subtle rumors, those whispered premonitions we talked about earlier, had laid the groundwork for an audience ready to react differently than it had in years past. In that moment, the room itself was speaking. Silence is loud when it carries expectation. The absence of applause carried the weight of judgment. And judgment, once internalized by a collective, can manifest in many ways: subtle scoffs, delayed claps, even, ultimately, audible boos. But the walk-in wasn't just a physical entrance. It was an emotional one. Every step Harry and Meghan took toward their table was under scrutiny. Every smile at a familiar face, every nod of acknowledgement, every slight laugh at a conversation snippet became a public performance. And yet, unlike past appearances, the audience wasn't fully willing to participate in the performance. It's here we notice a paradox. The walk-in demanded attention, yet the room withheld it. And that withholding is psychologically powerful, because humans respond to absence as much as to presence. When expected reactions fail to occur, it signals danger, error, or social disapproval. And in Hollywood, where image is everything, a lack of reaction is interpreted as an absence of endorsement. And the guests knew it. There's a reason why cameras lingered, even when producers tried to redirect focus. Because the tension was palpable, and the visual story it told was compelling. Two figures, poised and polished, facing a room that had subtly, yet unmistakably, shifted its allegiance. Now, consider Harry and Meghan's mental state in that moment. They'd entered a space where their prior narrative authority had been challenged. They'd heard the whispers of rumor. They'd sensed a subtle change in the air. And now, the silence, the hesitation, was tangible. It confirmed something they may not have consciously acknowledged. The room had moved on without them. That's a difficult realization for anyone, let alone public figures whose identities are so intertwined with perception. Yet they persisted. Their walk continued, controlled, purposeful, and unflinching. And that's when the first audible dissonance began. Not a roar, not chaos, not an explosion. Just a sound. Sharp, single, repeated. A sound that drew attention because it was unexpected. Boo. And in that instant, everything changed. The silence that had been dominating the room was pierced. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Cameras caught the moment. Social media exploded in real time. Clips circulated instantly, the audio enhanced, frames frozen and analyzed by audiences worldwide. The walk-in had set the stage. The whispering rumors had primed the room. The silence had amplified expectation. And now the sound became the punctuation mark on a sentence no one had thought would be written publicly. Let's pause to consider the psychological dynamics at play. The first person to react audibly didn't act in isolation. They acted on priming, rumor, and observation. Humans are wired to mirror collective behavior in ambiguous social settings. When the first person breaks the perceived norm, it creates permission, implicit, unspoken, for others to follow. And that's exactly what happened. The room didn't erupt into chaos, but it didn't need to. A few measured responses, murmured agreements, subtle laughter, additional murmurs, validated the initial disruption. Collective tension became collective acknowledgement. And Harry and Meghan, composed as they were, could feel the shift ripple through the space. It's fascinating to consider that this entire chain of events, rumor, anticipation, priming, silence, subtle cues, had led to a moment that appeared spontaneous. In reality, it was the culmination of months, even years, of emotional buildup, narrative saturation, and social conditioning. By the time the ceremony's official proceedings began, the walk-in had done its work. The room's temperature was no longer neutral. The audience was no longer universally receptive. And Harry and Meghan were no longer operating on the same assumptions they had in prior public spaces. The entrance, subtle as it seemed, had exposed the fracture lines. And fractures, once revealed, are difficult to ignore, especially in a world obsessed with optics. Now, here's the thing most people don't consider. The walk-in was more than just a physical act. It was a test. And tests reveal the truth about a room, a situation, and even a cultural climate. What did the walk-in reveal? It revealed that Hollywood had shifted beneath them. That empathy could thin. That curiosity could wane. That silence could speak louder than applause. And in that silence, the room prepared itself for the inevitable. The moment when restraint would fail and the truth of perception would finally be vocalized. But what came next, the moment the room's readiness turned into action, would shock even seasoned observers. Because when anticipation, rumor, and primed emotion collide, the first sound you hear is never the last. It happened fast, not violently, not explosively, not like a stadium chant or a protest. Just one sound, a single, sharp expression of discontent that cut through the polished atmosphere of the awards ceremony. Boo. And in that instant, everything shifted. Have you ever been in a room where one person's action suddenly validates the unspoken thoughts of dozens? That's what this was. Not a mob, not chaos, just the emergence of collective permission. The moment when private skepticism becomes audible, when silent agreement finds a voice. The first boo wasn't a mistake. It wasn't random. It wasn't an attack in the traditional sense. It was the culmination of tension, rumor, fatigue, and expectation, all carefully nurtured in the weeks leading up to that night. Think about the room. Hollywood insiders, critics, actors, directors, producers, people accustomed to controlling narratives, manipulating perception, maintaining appearances. And yet here they were, responding to a figure who had once commanded universal admiration. Not with applause, not with support, but with audible disapproval. The sound was measured, deliberate, quick enough to be shocking, but slow enough to draw attention. And what makes it even more intriguing is the reaction it prompted. Almost immediately, the people around the initial booer glanced at each other. Quick, subtle looks, checking to see if they should intervene, laugh it off, or join in. Some hesitated. Some smirked. Some remained still, choosing not to participate but silently acknowledging the sentiment. That hesitation is critical, because in social psychology, when a group is primed for an emotional response, the first individual action creates a ripple. Others follow not necessarily because they agree, but because the act makes it acceptable to do so. And that's exactly what happened in that room. The second boo followed, then a third, each smaller than a crescendo, each more telling than the last. People weren't screaming, but the sound was unmistakable. And what's fascinating is that the room's reaction wasn't uniform. Some looked surprised. Some looked relieved. Some leaned back in their seats, subtly signaling. Finally, someone said it. And here's the psychological nuance. None of the boos were directed with malice. That's not how this works in elite social spaces. This was about signaling, about expressing sentiment while maintaining social safety. People weren't attacking Harry and Meghan as individuals. They were expressing the tension they had been feeling collectively for months. The sense that the couple's presence no longer matched the room's current emotional climate. Let's pause here and consider the weight of that moment. This wasn't just a social gaffe. It was a revelation. A room of highly influential people, trained to mask discomfort, had allowed themselves to collectively express it. And by doing so, they revealed something deeper about the dynamics of Hollywood, perception, and the volatility of public favor. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan remained composed, at least on the surface. Their smiles did not waver. Harry's head tilted slightly, scanning the room, assessing, calculating. Meghan's posture remained immaculate, a shield against the subtle waves of judgment that hit them both. But in private moments later, sources say they acknowledged the impact. Even seasoned figures can feel the sting of collective disapproval, especially when it's unexpected, subtle, yet highly visible. And yet, it's important to emphasize, the boos didn't dominate the room. They didn't transform the ceremony into chaos. They were a symptom, not the cause. A visible, audible manifestation of months of social, emotional, and cultural shifts that had been quietly building. Social media amplified everything in real time. Clips of the booing were shared within minutes. Comments poured in, dissecting the moment frame by frame. Opinions formed instantly. The narrative began to crystallize. The royals had been heckled, and Hollywood had quietly sanctioned it. But there's a twist most people miss. The booing, as audible and shocking as it seemed, was not necessarily spontaneous. It was predictable, given the priming, the rumors, and the emotional fatigue that had set in. In other words, it wasn't an eruption. It was the logical outcome of conditions that had been cultivated long before that night. Think of it like a powder keg. The invitation, the rumors, the walk-in. Each was a spark or a small amount of friction. The room itself was dry tinder. The first audible boo didn't create the reaction. It merely confirmed it. And that confirmation is psychologically powerful. Once someone breaks the social barrier, others feel emboldened. You've seen it happen in crowds before. A small clap starts a wave. A single laugh spreads contagiously. But in this case, the spread wasn't joy. It was validation of dissent. And in Hollywood, dissent rarely manifests physically. It's subtle, controlled, and calculated.